Good morning, my good students. This is Dr. Morgan over at Clovis East High School. We're going to look at lesson 9.5a, the first of two lessons on two-way frequency tables. What we're trying to look at here with two-way frequency tables is we're trying to look at how two different sets of data might be related to each other. In other words, if you're comparing two different variables with each other and seeing if there's a relationship, and we often do that using a table. So let's get started. So we have a little problem here to look at. If you look at the table, it shows the number of bicycles owned. They asked the question of a group of boys and girls, how many of them owned a bicycle? And they put them down, the number of boys that owned bicycles and the number of boys that didn't own a bicycle, the number of girls who owned a bicycle, and the number of girls who did not know it. Well, it turned out that Aubrey, who took the thing, she looked at it and she concluded that girls are more likely to own bicycles. Now, why did she say that? She looked right here. She said, look, 18 girls own bicycles, only 16 boys. So she said it's obvious that it's more likely for a girl to own a bicycle. But is that really a valid conclusion? Well, let's look at it a little bit closer, okay? For example, while there is a greater number of girls who own bicycles, let's consider the percentage of boys and the percentage of girls that own bicycles. And notice in the boys, 16 own it, but total 16 and 4 is 20. So 16 out of 20. And the girls, you see, 18 and 30. See, there's more girls being asked the question. There's 10 more girls. So that you can't just say, well, there's more girls because you selected more girls. So the percentage of boys, 16 out of 20, 80% of the boys own a bicycle, whereas only 60% of the girls. So in reality, it's more likely that a boy will own a bicycle than a girl according to these numbers. So you can't just look at that raw number there. Let's look at a couple of definitions. What's a two-way frequency table? It's a table that displays frequency in two different categories. For example, here I have one category is, are they male or female? The second is they asked him what kind of movie do they like best, an action movie or a comedy movie. And then we set up a table, and notice you can see here, here's my total men, my total women. Here's the total number of people who liked action, the total number of people who like comedy. And these tell me, for example, 17 men preferred action, or 22 women preferred female. And that's how a two-way frequency table works. We also have frequencies in a two-way table. The joint frequency is simply the number of terms in the body of the table. In other words, a joint means two. Put two things together, so two categories. And in here you see, this is two things. It tells me 16 boys own a bicycle. Or this tells me that 12 girls do not own a bicycle. Those are called joint frequency. So is this one and this one. These are joint frequencies. On the other hand, marginal frequencies, the total number of data in a row or a column. So in other words, this is a marginal frequency right here. The 34 people own a bicycle, irrespective of whether a boy or girl. 16 people do not own a bicycle. So that's the total of the row. It's in, you might say, the margin of the table. Likewise over here, the total number of girls is 30 and the total number of boys are 40. That's the marginal frequency of boys or girls. So see how they're either the total of the column or the total of the row. Those are the marginal. And the last one is simply the grand total. How many people all together were involved in this survey? The next two vocabulary words have to do with relative frequencies. See the word relative frequencies and conditional relative frequencies. Whereas the frequencies before were strictly the number, when you use the word relative, you're relating them to something else. And in this case, on relative frequencies, we're relating them to the grand total. Okay? So if I take the number of boys who had bikes, for example, that was 16. But if I divide it by the total number, 50, I get a relative frequency of 32 hundredths. I mean, you might think of it as 32%. And likewise, the marginal relative frequency, the same thing. The total number of boys was 20 divided by the grand total. In other words, 40% or 0.4 hundredths or of the number of boys. That's my relative frequency. Relative frequency is always going to be a fraction there. You see, I'm comparing the frequency to the grand total. Now, the last one we're going to look at later on, be a little more tricky, is conditional relative frequency. And this occurs when I'm just looking at one row or either one row or one column. In other words, if a person is a boy, what's the relative frequency they own a bike? So the if statement tells me to just look, for example, here at the row of boys and ignore the rest of the data and ask if it's a boy already, so I'm already in this category, what's the chances that they own a bike? So that is now the boys that own a bike divided by the total of that row. All right, and that's how I get a conditional relative frequency. Could also be done, by the way, with a column, using a joint frequency over that column. We'll get into more of that as we go on. So let's get into the bulk of the notes. Some of this we just sort of went over with vocabulary, but let's hit it again. First of all, a frequency is the actual number of data values. All right. So we interviewed 50 people and they each have a value. All right. But now what category of frequency they are, the joint frequency is the actual number of data values in two categories. All right. In two categories. So that's why, for example, 16 boys who own bicycles. See, the two categories. Any of these in the red here, this one, those are all joint frequencies. They tell me the number of data in two categories. This is number 4. 4 means there are 4 boys who do not own bicycles. All right. Now, the next category is a marginal category. In the margin, we're looking at the data values for one total category. All right, this could be either a row or a column. So, for example, here there are 34 people who own bicycles in this column. That's the marginal frequency, the actual number, 34. Oh, I can do a row too. There, for example, here there were 30 girls that we surveyed. That's the marginal frequency. That's the number of girls we surveyed. Notice they only involve one thing: man, boy, girl, own or don't own. They're not like the joint that have 2. And finally, the last one we have is simply the grand total. How many people in this corner were totally involved in the survey? So let's try problem 1. On Saturday, 201 tickets were sold for 2 movies, movie A and movie B. Of the 103 tickets sold for movie A, 78 were sold to men. Of the 98 tickets sold for movie B, 86 were sold to women. Let's create a frequency table. So let's look at the data and just fill in what we know. First of all, we know that 201 tickets were sold total for both movies. That's my grand total. So that goes down in the lower right corner. So we have movie A, movie B, and we have men and women. The next sentence says, of the 103 tickets sold for movie A, so that's the total tickets sold for movie A, so that's a marginal frequency, the total of movie A, which is right here. See, it's the total of the column, movie A. There's my marginal frequency right there, okay? Now, of those 103, though, it says that 78 were sold to men. So of the 103, 78 tickets were sold to A. So 78 men in movie A. That's a joint frequency. 2 things. Men in movie A, 78. Next sentence. Of the 98 tickets sold for movie B, so that's my total for B, 98. 86 were sold to women. So that's my joint frequency, women who went to B, 86. Now that's all the data we have, but we can use that to fill it in. For example, I can look at the first column, 78, 103 minus 78 means that the number of women who went had to be 25. Likewise, in the second column, if 86 were women and we sold 98, 98 minus 86 is 12. So that fills in there. And then we can add the total of men, add that up, and the total of women. And now we have our two-way frequency table complete. So now let's answer the questions. What's the joint frequency? All right. Again, joint means two-way, two categories. So which one is women who saw B? So they had to be a woman, if I draw this like this, who saw movie B. There's my answer. Women who saw movie B would be 86. What's the marginal frequency? Now again, this is just one category. So it's just asking me, what was the total number of people who saw movie A? Well, that's going to be the total of column A. Movie A total was 103. Lastly, what's the marginal frequency? Again, marginal means just one category. What's the marginal frequency for men who went to the movies? So the key thing is I want to know who the men were. So that's going to be the total of the row. The total number of men was 90. So that would be the answer to that one. So let's try a second problem. This should be very similar. Recently, a survey was taken of 300 freshmen at Clovis High Schools about which coffee they prefer, Starbucks or Dutch Brothers. What was the total number of people involved? The grand total? 300. All right. Of the 240 students who preferred Starbucks, so that's going to be my marginal. The total who preferred Starbucks will be the total of the Starbucks column. So the 240 will be the total of the Starbucks. Of those, 126 were girls. So I'm looking for girls who like Starbucks. Girls who like Starbucks. So in that category, we're going to put 126. Now the next sentence, of the 60 students who preferred Dutch Brothers, so that's my total Dutch Brothers, 60 there, 21 were boys. So again, boys who prefer Dutch Brothers, joint category, 21. Now we fill in the missing ones. If there were 200 people that preferred Starbucks and 126 were girls, 240 minus 126 means that there were 114 boys that prefer Starbucks. If there were 60 people who preferred Dutch Brothers, the next column, and 21 were boys, 60 minus 21 means there were 39 girls who preferred. Now let's add up the boys and add up the girls. Double check here. You want to make sure that these add up to that. If they don't, it just means you did an addition or subtraction wrong up above. So what's the joint frequency? Joint, again, two categories. So I'm looking for boys who prefer Dutch Brothers. Boys who prefer Dutch Brothers. So there's my answer. 21. What's the marginal frequency? This is one category. In other words, what's the marginal frequency of students who prefer Starbucks? In other words, how many total students preferred Starbucks? So find the column for Starbucks. All right. What's the total Starbucks column? 240. Lastly, what's the marginal frequency of the girls who took the survey? How many total girls did we survey? Look at the total row for the girls to the right, 165. And that's how we fill that out. And that's how we identify, again, the joint frequencies would be these in the middle here. These are all joints because they tell you two things: boys Starbucks, boys Dutch Brothers, girls Starbucks, girls Dutch Brothers. The marginal ones tell you the sum. So like this is these two down here, this is the total Starbucks, total coffee, and then over here in the margin, total boys, total girls. And then lastly, of course, this is our grand total. So up to this point, we've just used regular frequencies, which is simply what is the total number in each category. Now we're going to use relative frequency, and what's different here is we're now going to change them into fractions or percents, and however way you want to look at it. We're going to take whatever the frequency was and divide it by the grand total. So you see here, here's our frequency table for bicycles, girls, and bicycles. And notice we had 16 boys who owned bicycles. But this time we're going to divide it by the grand total. Remember, the grand total was 50. So I end up with a fraction now, 0.32. In other words, 32% of the people in the survey were boys who owned bicycles. Okay? I can do the same thing with a marginal. For example, the total number of people who owned a bicycle was 34, the marginal frequency. If I divide it again by the grand total, I find out that 68% of the people who were surveyed owned bicycles, irrespective of whether they were girls or boys. So let's use the data from problem 1 and make a two-way relative. Again, relative. So we're going to take exactly what we had before, and we're going to divide it by the grand total. Okay? So for example, the grand total was 201. So the number of men who liked movie A was 78. So 78 divided by 201 is 39 hundredths, or I could say 39%. And I just walked through and do each of them. Movie B, there were 12 people out of the grand total, 201. That meant there were 6% that liked that. And here for the women, 25 out of 201 is 12%. And for the women who like B, 86 out of 201, 403. So I can do that. Those would all be joint. These would all be my joint. This would be my joint relative frequency. Joint relative. The relative says I divided it by the grand total. Now we can also do the marginal relative frequencies. So the total of men and women was 103. And again, the total divided by the grand total gives me 51%, or 51 hundredths, were preferred movie A. And for B, the same thing, 98, 201, 49%. And then we do for men and women. And obviously, when we add them all up, 201 divided by 201 is 1, or 100%. Again, these down here are my marginal relative frequencies. Is simply the margin divided by the grand total. All right. So now that we've created the table, what's the joint relative frequency of men who saw, of women who saw movie A? So I want joint. That's going to be 2. Women who saw movie B. Women who saw movie B. And my the joint frequency is 86. The joint relative frequency compared to the total number is, actually I did it wrong here. This should have been A, is 12%. So the answer is 12 hundredths is the joint relative frequency of women who prefer movie A. What's the joint relative frequency of men who saw B? So men to B is going to be in that category there. The joint frequency is 12. The joint relative frequency, 12 divided by the grand total 201, is 6 hundredths, or about 6%. What's the marginal? Here is not 2. It's just 1 of people who saw movie A. So the marginal frequency of people who saw A was 103. But now if I take that and I divide it by the grand total 201, I find out that the marginal relative frequency is 51 hundredths, or you could say 51%. So again, the relative frequency is simply the joint or the marginal frequency divided by the grand total. Notice if you added all these up, they'd add up to 1. Okay. So problem 4 is just like problem 3. We're going to use the data from problem 2 about Starbucks and Dutch Brothers and make a relative table. We're just going to take every frequency in the table in problem 2 and divide it by the grand total. In this case, the total number of people that surveyed were 300. So for example, the number of boys who liked Starbucks was 114. And I divide it by my grand total of 300, and I get 38 hundredths, or 38% of the people surveyed were boys who like Starbucks. There were 21 boys that liked Dutch Brothers, so 21 divided by the grand total 300, 7% of the total were boys who liked Starbucks. Girls, 126 girls liked Starbucks. Out of the total number surveyed, 300, that makes 42%. And finally, 39 girls like Dutch Brothers, 39 100, 13%. So again, these are the joint relative frequency. Joint, because joint, if you're ever in woodworking, a joint is where you put two pieces together. And here's where we put two pieces, boys in Starbucks or girls in Dutch Brothers. So those are the joint, and they're relative because in each case we divided them by the grand total. So next we'll do the margins. Now the margins are not joints. They only have to do with one thing. So for example here, the total number of people who like Starbucks is 240. Out of the total number 300, that makes 80%. 80% of the people surveyed prefer Starbucks. Then 60 out of 300, the other 20% prefer Dutch Brothers. Now again, these are what we call the marginal. These are marginal relative, okay? We have two more marginals here, the sum of the rows as well. We need to finish up. So the total number of boys surveyed was 135. So 45% of the boys of the survey were boys. And then 55% were girls, 165. And of course, the last column, you take the grand total and divide it by itself. That's just 1, 300 by 1. Now let's answer the question. What's the joint relative frequency? Boys who prefer Starbucks. So boys and Starbucks, right there. Find the two where they overlap. And the answer is 3800ths or 38%. What's the joint relative frequency of girls who prefer Dutch Brothers? So I look across girls till I get to Dutch Brothers. Here's my answer there. And that's going to be 13%. And then the marginal relative frequency of students who prefer Dutch Brothers. That's going to be in the total number of people who prefer Dutch Brothers as a percent of the total. So 60 out of 30, 20% or 20/100ths. All right, that was a relatively short lesson, but I hope it prepares you to do the homework. It should be easy. The two things we're working on today was simply frequency, how many in each category, and then relative frequency meant you take the frequency and divide by the grand total. All right? Have a good day, guys.